Now that you've watched the video, maybe you want to write down your notes on your thoughts. What happened there? What sort of gender discourse was at play? What did the gender discourse do politically and economically? What was the impact that the video made in you? What do you think was the aim of the video? Yeah, just write down some of your own analysis. I personally really like that video. I think it's a very, very powerful video. And I think a lot of the things that are said there are, of course, true. I think it kind of succeeds in turning the critical eye to some gender discourses of not just, I'm not your poster child and that sort of thing, while at the same time really maybe doing that same thing. One of the things, one of the things that I kind of find bothering in that video, and there are several others of that kind of, is that investing in a girl has to be done for economic purposes, rather than it's simply the right of girls and boys and of all genders to be invested and to be cared for. So that video gives the message that, okay, but this is the most powerful tool for you. Girl is the most powerful tool for you in the world to sustain economic growth. And this is where, something very strange happens. And while at the same time, you can argue that maybe this is in the present world in which we live, where one could argue that in order to make something to happen, we need to make the argument that to do this, something economically productive, something growth will follow. So maybe that sort of argument is strategically useful in improving girls' lives in this world. But at the same time, does it have to be this way? Can we imagine a world where it would be valuable to invest in things considered as feminine, even when it didn't bring growth in the old, productive, masculine sense of the world? Yeah, I want you to hold on with that question. Right. I promised in the beginning or some slides ago, I suppose, that I would get back to the concept of intersectionality, which is, of course, a very, very central term in feminist international political economy. I think it would count as one core concept in feminist international political economy and feminist politics altogether. Some people argue that it's, and I think it also holds true, that intersectionality also tends to be these days in a lot of feminist analysis, it can be a concept that it's just thrown in there and then not really followed analytically. So that, okay, we say that intersectional feminism is important, but then we don't really take all kinds of intersectionalities into account in our own analysis of the world. And I think this is a fair critique. But nevertheless, intersectionality is a core concept in feminist international political economy, and it is important to understand what intersectionality means. Because, of course, we can't really use it analytically unless we know what it is about. So, intersectionality, in short, means that gendered hierarchies and gendered power relations always intersect with all kinds of other power relations. So, gendered power relations are not the only power relations that organize the world. There are other power relations organizing the world simultaneously. And these power relations, they get entangled in various ways. And they get entangled in particular situated practices. There is not an overarching truth that intersectionality always means this and that. No, we need to think about intersectionality in each particular political context, and look at the practices that are going on there, and consider the power relations that are at place and emergent and getting entangled and disentangled in exactly those practices. So, gendered hierarchies always intersect with other differences such as sexuality, class, race, ethnicity, religion, language, education, disability and ability, age, ableism, all kinds of other power relations are at place simultaneously with gendered hierarchies and gendered politics. And these entanglements and intersectionalities are context specific. So, the core concept of intersectionality then calls into question monolithic and fixed categories of gender and sexuality. So this means that there is really no one way of being a woman or man or any other gender or sexuality. Then at this point, we might want to return to V. Spike Peterson's two approaches to gender and reconsider them a little bit. And I know that V. Spike Peterson has done wonderful work since 2005, but I want to, in this lecture, return to those two categories. I still think that this is her understanding of two approaches to gender is a very good explanation of how gender is understood in international political economy. But we might want to look at those two understandings again. So, first, empirical understanding of gender, where gender marks the hierarchy between men and women, and focuses often on women and girls, and sometimes on men and boys, and this we find often in policy discourses, for instance. And then the second understanding, analytical, gender understood as a governing code that shapes the ways things are valued. We focus on hierarchies between things coded as masculine and feminine. So, any problems here? What do we think about the split in between masculine and feminine in the analytical category of gender? Because there is still, even in the analytical category of gender, even though it allows us to analyze more in depth how our world is governed through gendered power relations. But there is still a binary at play. There is a binary at play between masculine and feminine, between rational and emotional, mind and body, public, private, production and reproduction. But what happens within that split? There's life in those splits too. How do we account for that split in feminist international political economy? And this is where we get to queer approaches to international political economy. So, how do we queer gender? What about sex? I've mentioned that previously throughout the lecture. Sexuality and a bit like, okay, I mentioned this. How should I say this? Oh, did I say it right? Okay, did I use the right language? And this is because we are quite stuck with binary understanding of gender still in our thought systems, and also in feminism, I would say. I'm kind of in the learning process of queer approaches myself. And of course, as I mentioned previously, all these language questions as well, that to talk about the queer in your own language might be quite different to how it is spoken about in the academia, which follows the really rather English spoken colonialism, one would say. And then how do you make yourself understood in a way that you are simultaneously inclusive? But this nevertheless means that we need, even though you will know the exact right terminology, we do need to talk about the queer. We do need to try and comprehend what happens between the split between masculinities and femininities. And I think as feminists, because we are accustomed to analyzing intersectional gender relations and intersectional gender relations of power in politics, we have a lot of tools to do this, and we have a lot of tools to be self-reflexive in our analysis. So what about gender, queer in gender, and what about sex, and what about queer in IPE? Of course, queer scholars such as Judith Butler have written about these things for decades already. It's all been out there. And then in international political economy, there is, for instance, the work of Nicholas Smith, who's done wonderful work on queering political economy, which you should look up. But let's start with Butler. In the book, Bodies That Matter, on the discursive limits of sex, she writes, "Sex is not simply what one has, or a static description of what one is. It is one of the norms by which the one becomes viable at all. That which qualifies a body for life within the domain of cultural intelligibility." So this really points out that it's not actually adequate that we only analyze gendered relations of power, but we need to also pay attention to sex and sexuality, and also what happens in these gendered relations that don't quite fall into the binary of gender. We need to analyze gender on one hand. We need and the things that go beyond our binary understandings of gender, and then we need to analyze sexuality on the other hand, and the varieties of sexualities that exist in the world. And then we need to understand how these two realms also entangle. And that, again, if we go back to the feminist slogan of personal is political, in international political economy, that adds whole new layers to international political economy and our understanding thereof. So let's watch another YouTube video, and I really like this. So watch the video, and again, please feel free to take notes, add questions maybe to your own research diary or lecture diary, and then maybe return to them when you do the coursework for this course.